Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Society. My name is Peter Williams. I'm Vice President here, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce this evening's distinguished lecturer. Before I get to the event itself, can I please remind you of two things. The first, if you have not done so already, would you please switch off your mobile phone? I say that to avoid your future embarrassment, because I should remind you, secondly, that this lecture is being webcast to an audience which is literally global and very appropriately indeed. And indeed, when we come to questions from our distinguished speaker in a little while's time, I will ask you all at that point to stand up so that you can be seen on camera and give your name and your affiliation so that we know who you are for the record. Procedural and business and housekeeping matters aside, my real pleasure this evening is to introduce to you David Edgerton, who is going to speak to the social function of history, policy history, and 20th century science. Many of you, and I've been standing by the door watching David welcoming almost every other guest, if not every guest, know David and his background, so I don't need to labour and embarrass him unduly. He and I share a common background at St John's College in Oxford, at various parts in our career. But David did something very unusual in moving, as you're well aware, from a chemistry degree at Oxford to a PhD in history. That of itself is perhaps not wholly unusual, though rather rare, but to do so at Imperial College as well, I think says much about our speaker and much about the topic which he's going to be addressing here this evening. You will all have read, I'm sure, David's copious publications, but you haven't read one yet, which is, I think, nearly in press on World War II about how Britain won. And David, we eagerly await your next treatise on Iraq, perhaps, in the years to come. But, ladies and gentlemen, my very great pleasure is to invite David Edgerton to address us now. David.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great honour to be invited to give this lecture. So I note with a mixture of pleasure and sadness that among many distinguished predecessors have been three of my teachers. One of them, Peter Lipton, died tragically in 2007. Indeed, the last time I saw him was in this very building. The first time I was in this room must have been in 1983. I remember still the announcement that the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, had been elected to the Fellowship of the Society. Now, many Prime Ministers have become Fellows, and Lady Thatcher, an Oxford-trained chemist, was unusually well qualified. Yet it was, of course, a controversial election because of her politics and what she was doing to the universities. Her own university launched a campaign to prevent her getting an honorary degree. A group called Save British Science was formed. It established relations between the state, universities, and science were thrown into doubt. Now, the only other Prime Minister to have had a university education in science was Neville Chamberlain. His picture is missing from a selection of photographs of fellows who were Prime Ministers downstairs. Do have a look. He had no such trouble, but he and his policies for research had critics, among them men who would become advisors to his government. Among them was J.D. Bernal. My title alludes to his Social Function of Science, published in January 1939. It was an ornament to the Anglo-Marxism of the 1930s, an extraordinary combination of contemporary history with an unsurpassed survey of British research in the 1930s and a plan for the future. Social Function, I want to argue, inaugurated a great tradition of linking contemporary history with policy in Britain. 20 years later, in May 1959, C.P. Snow's Two Cultures lecture was given, by far the most influential of such linkings, despite its slender size. Both remain hugely influential, directly and indirectly, today. In this lecture, I'll argue that history had a surprisingly important role in debates around research policy in Britain. And I'm referring not just to the history written by scientists, but also that written by professional historians. And drawing on my own experience of participating as a historian in many discussions of policy, with experts in science policy, with politicians and scientists and engineers over the last 20 years, I want to reflect on what history has done and what it might do. New histories have different implications for policy than the older ones. Yet my most important point is that the new history can raise the general level of discussion of the relations of science and society as well as of policy. And appreciating the sheer complexity of the relations of policy and history in the case of science is in itself a step in the right direction. Now, science has the past in its bones. Science has never been just about the creation of the new. Even after its dominant public face became futuristic, its mission research, and its product innovation. The Royal Society has upcoming celebrations of 350 years of its history. It produces, so regularly that we don't really notice it, indispensable biographical memoirs of fellows. And witness the commemorations this year of 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species and the bicentenary of the birth of its author. Is there a living British scientist better known than Charles Darwin? Is there a commentator on science in Britain more famous than C.P. Snow? And where does this leave the professional history of science? There are complaints that it's not taken seriously enough, similar to those of scientists who bemoan the lack of public understanding of science, or PUS. Yet historians were amongst the first to point out that the deficit model doesn't work. The world out there is saturated with understandings of science, and one might add, of the past of science as well. A second argument, also analogous to that of the scientists, is that there's a lack of media exposure for professional history of science. Yet think of a TV series by Simon Schaffer, A Point of View by Lisa Jardine, the appearance of innumerable colleagues on Start the Week and In Our Time. Economic, political, military, cultural historians would kill for this kind of, let's call it, public impact factor. The essential problem for professional historians of science is the lack of authority over the field of history of science. It's the kind of history the public get, which is the problem. Now, this might seem like an absurd or mischievous pedantry, like blaming train delays on the wrong kind of snow. But there are different kinds of histories, and we historians have labelled what we take to be pernicious forms, which we see everywhere, with terms of art, like Whig history, or technological determinism, or old docs history, or antiquarianism, or drum and bugle histories. Now, these are throwaway insults. We need to study, I think, as historians, the content and assumptions of the non-professional accounts of science and society, including histories, and to do so over time. This can be rather disconcerting, to historians certainly, as sometimes policy arguments from the past get turned into assumptions, frames of understandings for our histories, as I will show. The technocratic moment of the late 1950s and early 1960s has been crucial in creating arguments which long underpinned histories of British science and technology. One of its most characteristic and influential formulations was the two cultures itself. It's been replayed many times, and it's still held to be insightful today. For example, next month, as part of the Bristol Festival of Ideas, the whole essay will be read out aloud by an actor. Indeed, the next time I'll be in this room will be to hear a discussion about the two cultures, including the Secretary of State for Innovation, Universities and Skills. It matters. Indeed, it certainly isn't just scientists who think that Snow wrote the right kind of history. The historian Eric Hobsbawm recently observed that Snow overplayed his hand, though not as absurdly as his chief antagonist F.R. Leavis, but fundamentally he was right. Now, Hobsbawm is not alone amongst arts graduates in thinking this, far from it. And here, then, is the delicious paradox. The centrality of the two cultures thesis to British elite culture refutes the thesis itself, just as Snow's own career refutes his own thesis. Indeed, Britain has had any number of polymathic bridgers of the two cultures, not least represented in an unusually strong history of science community. Indeed, Snow's two cultures help promote the teaching of the history of science and technology in British universities. Many of us here are beneficiaries of that. The significance of Snow lies in what his work and its reception tells us about British culture. And what it tells us is that Snow's is very definitely the wrong kind of history. Let me put it concretely. Understanding why Snow was wrong and why he was and is influential is now a minimum condition for professional historical work on science and in British society in the 20th century. Now, this may seem harsh, But the two cultures, or rather the tradition it exemplifies and sustained, created a conceptual mush on which, if I can put it this way, the locomotive of history could get no traction. It sucked science, technology, modernity out of British history, leaving it, ironically, overpopulated with literary intellectuals. It stands in the way of getting to grips with the presence of science and technology in modern British history. For this reason, I've described it as an anti-history in an, I fear, entirely failed attempt to drive a stake through its heart. I wish Gaio Tolano better luck with his brilliant new book, which I commend to you, called The Two Cultures Controversy, just out. My focus today is history and policy, the name, incidentally, of an organisation and a website based at the Centre for Contemporary British History here in London and the Cambridge History Faculty. It's had great success in bringing the highest quality historical research to bear on policy questions and to the attention of policymakers. And the response of historians, interestingly, myself included, has been notably enthusiastic as well. In the case of proposing and arguing about policies for research, histories have long been central. The social function, I've mentioned as a pioneering case. It argued that there was a collapse of innovativeness, and especially in the use of innovations under capitalism in the 1920s and 1930s. It called for socialism, as well as for the planning of science. The two cultures gave a historical account of deficiencies in British culture and its education system in particular, to promote scientific and technological education. We might also note Hilary and Stephen Rose's even more historical Science and Society of 1969, very largely about Britain, the works of J.G. Crowther as well, all supporting a more interventionist policy for research in Britain. And in the Thatcher period, we had a major political shift with Terence Keeley's Economic Laws of Scientific Research, which, despite its title, was mainly a work of history. Now, professional historians, too, have long been concerned with policy for science. 1964 saw the publication of two important official histories of science in the Second World War by M.M. Poston and others, and Margaret Gowing on the British atomic programme. Now, these official histories were meant to inform policy in the future. And indeed, the civil histories of the Second World War were, according to Eric Hobsbawm, pioneering works of contemporary history, and I agree with that. Neither Poston nor Gowing were then historians of science. It wasn't really until the 1970s that professional historians of science, led by Roy MacLeod, opened up the study of the state's support of science in early 20th century Britain. But again, there was a connection to policy. Much of the work was done in Sussex alongside the Science Policy Research Unit. Indeed, that unit's most important book, published in 1980, Technical Innovation and British Economic Performance, had at least as much evidence from the 1870s as the 1970s. In Manchester, too, history and policy, if I can put it that way, marched together, as can be seen in Philip Gummett's largely historical survey, Scientists in Whitehall, also of 1980. But it was in the middle 1980s that particular historical accounts of British science and technology, surprisingly often focusing on the 1870s and 1914, was central to the debate about research, about universities, and indeed education in general. The Thatcher government was strongly influenced by this work, but it was also central to the argument of the opponents of that government. There was agreement, widespread agreement, that British culture had been hostile to science, especially applied science, with dire consequences for the economy. The disagreement was in what to do about it. Now, these influential histories were profoundly negative accounts of British science. They were a story of failure, of decline, made worse, it seemed, by an impressive number of Nobel Prizes or supersonic aircraft. Snow, the two cultures, was all over these works. This was history with systematic and massive forgetting built into it. For example, if one had called in the late 1980s or early 1990s for the concentration of most research and development funding in one ministry, for the appointment of the President of the Royal Society to be scientific advisor to that ministry, if one had proposed the raising of the R&D GDP ratio to nearly 3%, if one had suggested that British business should do more R&D than that of any country other than the USA, And if one suggested, on top of all that, that government research should be intimately tied to realistic industrial priorities, you'd be regarded as ludicrously ambitious, certainly given what was taken to be the deeply entrenched cultural hostility to policies of this kind. But if you've been reading the emergent post-declinist history of Britain, you'd have recognized something different. You'd have seen that this was a call for return to the Britain of the late 1960s. To put it another way, Britain met the Lisbon targets, for science policy wonks here, 40 years ago. Now, we've got away from stories of past failure and begun to chart a new account of 20th century British science in a refashioned historical context in which it's possible to understand the centrality first of, say, H.G. Wells and later of C.P. Snow. It's not a history of lacks, but of huge investments in research and development, a history of scientist ministers, scientist members of parliament, of businesses run by scientists. It's a complex historical story, one that we can only tell when we shed naive assumptions about, say, the relations of national investment in research and national economic growth. Indeed, I want to take some examples from cases well known through historical research already by the mid-1960s, in particular radar and the British atomic bomb project. In doing so, I can't help but note that 70 years ago today, Adolf Hitler celebrated his 50th birthday. Now, this was a major public event across the newly expanded German Reich. Bohemian Moravia had just been taken over. But it was also probably celebrated with a party in this building, which perhaps not everybody here will know was the then German embassy. Now, in 1935, there was no radar in Britain. By 1945, it was a vast enterprise. It's an exaggeration to say that radar saved Britain in 1940, but it was a hugely important warfighting instrument. It was used from the first not just to detect aircraft, but to aim guns on land and at sea. It was used for navigation and targeting. The rate of development was extraordinary. While nearly all night bombers could get through to bomb London in 1940, by 1944, radar-controlled guns firing shells with proximity fuses would have made a 1940-style blitz impossible. Now, it's not sufficiently appreciated that Britain had a very large bomb project at the beginning of the war. I mean, an atomic bomb project, probably the largest of any country. Experiments had started in the summer of 1939. Unlike in the radar case, the work was done largely in universities and in industry, with a large contribution by émigrés, because they could not be directly employed by government. Through the defeat in France and through the Blitz, this long-term project accelerated. The expectation was that atomic bombs would be cheaper than TNT bombs. Now, the British project was to go to North America, and Britain became a very junior and often abused partner in the Manhattan Project. Now, familiar as these stories are, I'd like to emphasize some less familiar aspects. First, neither radar nor the bomb were British inventions, nor did Britain work on them alone. Nearly every major power had projects in both areas. The idea of radar was widely known internationally before 1935. The great and sudden interest in the possibility of the bomb came from experimental work in continental Europe. In neither case were British academics critical. They had to be inducted into radar. And in the case of the bomb, it's notable how few of the major British atomic physicists were involved at the beginning. Yet academics were to become essential to the development of both technologies. As we know, both projects needed and used people from many different scientific backgrounds. What's the point here? It's that universities produce people and knowledge and not inventions. The second point is the importance of the Oxford chemistry-industry nexus. Let me start with Sir Henry Tizard, very well-known figure. Not so well known that he was a specialist in aviation fuels, and that he was involved not only in radar, but also in the early atomic bomb project. Another key Oxford figure was the physicist Frederick Lindemann, a key promoter of the bomb, a project that he and Churchill put under the ministerial authority of Sir John Anderson, an Edinburgh chemist. Anderson had been a director of Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI, and he appointed Sir Wallace Akers, or Wallace Akers as he then was, to head the British bomb project. Akers graduated in chemistry from Christ Church, Oxford. He'd been chairman of ICI's Billingham division until 1937. He then directed the ICI rearmament effort, centred on poison gas, explosives and propellants, and later aviation spirit. Now, ICI Billingham was a very important place indeed. This was the centre of synthetic ammonia and synthetic petrol production, based on German processes, incidentally. It recruited the cream of Oxford chemistry and Cambridge engineering. Now, radar too depended on industry, and the British electrical and electronic industry benefited hugely in the late 1930s from Britain having had the first large-scale television broadcasting system, also based on imported technologies. We might conclude then that both stories tell us that Britain was good at developing, but not necessarily the best at inventing. Now, older stories have overemphasized connections between Cambridge University, physics, and the left. They've underemphasized Oxford, industry, chemistry, and the right. An important reason for this significant disparity in treatment was the genius, the fame, the public presence of Bernal. His social function of science, for example, radically downplayed the significance of industrial research. But just as significant was the work of the Cambridge chemist C.P. Snow, who merely damned the most extraordinary science-politics partnership in 20th century British history, that between the historian Winston Churchill and the physicist Frederick Lindemann. I won't say any more about that. It's a fascinating story to be retold. Now, the great bulk of British research, like that on radar and the bomb, was done outside the Research Council system. And yet, the research councils were long at the centre of accounts of government and research. Now, the first research council was called the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. It was established in 1915 with an advisory council under the Privy Council and the Lord President of the Council. The idea was extended by the recommendation of Lord Haldane. And here he is, R.B. Haldane, a great Liberal and later Labour politician, lawyer, and intellectual who was twice Lord Chancellor. He suggested the establishment of the Medical Research Council on the same basis as the DSIR. Now, much has been written on the research councils, mostly by themselves, an important reason, indeed, for their overrepresentation in accounts of government and research. Take an example. In 1962, the secretary of the DSIR, the permanent secretary in effect, Sir Harry Melville, another chemist, published a very long, though hardly scintillating, account of his department. But from the point of view of policy debate today, there's something interesting about it. There is no mention anywhere in that long book of the Haldane principle. Yet that Haldane principle has been said again and again to have been central to British Research Council and even more erroneously to all British research funding since 1918 to this day. It still matters in science policy circles today. But Sir Harry was not at fault for omitting it. In 1962, the Haldane principle did not exist. Searches through JSTOR, Nature, and Hansard confirm this. In fact, they show there were already two different and unrelated Haldane principles in the literature. But Hansard contains traces of the invention of our Haldane principle. Austin Albu, Imperial College engineer, industrialist, and Labour MP, noted in February 1964 that the Conservative government was attacking the Labour opposition's plans for science on the grounds that Labour was seeking to control the work of scientists, an argument made against Bernal earlier. And he said this: allied to this political propaganda is the discovery of a new scientific principle, the Haldane principle, the principle that all scientific research in support of government policy must be conducted in independent research establishments. Now, that is not much like the principle in play today, but then as now, the meaning of the principle was far from stable. Now, later in that same year, with the Labour Party in office, Lord Halesham, Quinted Hogg as he became, who had been in charge of the research councils from 1957 to 1964, attacked Labour's introduction of the Ministry of Technology, one of its key initiatives. He claimed, in doing so, the Haldane principle as his. Of the Ministry of Technology, he said this: "This is a totally new departure from recent practice, and in my opinion at least, it is a most retrograde step. Ever since 1915, it has been considered axiomatic that responsibility for industrial research and development is better exercised in conjunction with research in the medical, agricultural, and other fields on what I have called the Haldane principle, through an independent council of industrialists, scientists, and other eminent persons, and not directly by a government department itself." So Haldane's principle is different from Albu's. Halesham's principle is different. And Halesham's Haldane principle is that of independence, not of science or research establishments, but of research councils of industrialists, scientists, and other eminent persons. And he was indeed right to say that large chunks of the 1915 or 1918 arrangements had been torn up in 1964, and not merely in relation to industrial research. Now, Halesham was, like Haldane, a lawyer. He would indeed become Lord Chancellor later. He'd been Lord President of the Council and Minister for Science, not of Science, as he insisted. He wrote an excellent book, came out in 1963, called Science and Politics. He lauded the Research Council system. He was a great defender of academic and scientific freedom. He indeed expressed concern that governments, including British governments, were corrupting the essence of science. Now, Halesham was clearly much influenced by the Freedom in Science lobby, a proto-Thatcherite CIA-funded organisation more focused on Oxford than Cambridge, among whose luminaries were the Manchester chemist Michael Polanyi and the Oxford biologist J.R. Baker. For some, like Halesham, and indeed another great panjandrum of research policy of the time, the chemist Lord Todd, the Haldane principle had the dignity of antiquity. For others, its antiqueness was a measure of its lack of relevance. Many people back in 1964 and since referred to the Haldane principle to say, how could a principle or a policy of 1918 be useful in the 1960s? Indeed, the principle was invented at the very moment it was seriously challenged, and it would reappear in discussion at just such moments of contention. The Rothschild reforms to some research councils in 1972, the Thatcher revolution of the 1980s, and more recently. It is now indeed a hot topic of the Parliamentary Select Committee on Innovation, Universities and Skills. The current government indeed says it believes in the Haldane principle and its relevance. Again, it is for some, in this debate going on now, a great truth from 1918. For others, it's an antiquated albatross around the neck of British research policy. Of course, it's neither of these things. There was no Magna Carta, no Bill of Rights, no Human Rights Act, no Constitution for British government-funded research in 1918 or ever. There were lots of different arrangements and for different aspects. It was the case, however, that in the realm of education and non-departmental research, there was a powerful sense in government of the limits of appropriate intervention. In the interwar years, for example, schools were funded by central government, but not run by them. The same was true, certainly, of universities, and research councils owed something, perhaps a great deal, to this model. Indeed, it was often regarded as a great British strength that its school and university teachers were not fonctionnaires. Central funding without central control was seen as the characteristic of a mature and free society. But it didn't mean that scientists were in charge. Remember those industrialists and other eminent persons. Now, one of the many oddities of the discussion of Haldane was that it didn't involve the Second World War. Yet this is eloquent testimony to the fact that the research councils were not very significant in the war effort. Their spending did not go up very much, either during the war or after it. University research in nearly all subjects fell strongly during the war. Universities became militarized teaching institutions. And students in approved subjects were rushed through courses where failure meant call-up. Men in non-essential subjects didn't get to go or didn't get to finish degrees. They were immediately called up. In a view which is really rarely expressed, Sir Henry Tizard, of all people, claimed of the Second World War, "It is a mistake to suppose that science advances rapidly in a war. Certain branches of science may receive a special stimulus, but on the whole, the advance of knowledge is slowed." Now, Bernal and many others had a very different view. Indeed, partly as a result of their efforts, the Second World War is generally seen as having been hugely important and good for British scientific research. Now, after the war, the main concern of government was to increase productivity of industry and exports. Another was to develop the empire, and indeed a large colonial research council was created outside the usual structures that was soon spending more than the Medical Research Council or the Agricultural Research Council, as Bernal was one of the few to notice. Now, one might assume in the stories of the transformation of the place of science due to the war that domestic research would be at the top of the agenda of government in the late 1940s. And so it was in some respects, the atomic bomb being one. Yet in 1948, the man now in effect chief scientific advisor, Sir Henry Tizard, once again, took a different view. He noted that Sweden and Switzerland were doing well, but were doing so, he thought, because they focused on technology, a term whose meaning was expanding, rather than scientific research. He said this, "I quote them in support of my view that it is not the general expansion of research in this country that is of the first importance for the restoration of its industrial health, and certainly not the expansion of government research remote from the everyday problems of industry. What is of first importance is to apply what is already known." I'm going to skip Sir Solly because we're going to run out of time. Back to the linear model. The idea that basic fundamental research is the main source of economic growth. This is a view that wasn't shared by any serious analyst, clearly not shared by Sir Henry Tizard there, not shared by Sir Solly Zuckerman either. They knew where the big money went. They knew that invention had many sources, including these great men, industrialists, I think he meant, that Tizard was referring to. Now, the linear model of innovation is, like Haldane, a term of art in science policy. It's also an invention. In this case, an academic rather than a political one, and dates from the 1980s, not the 1960s. It's often associated with a foundational document, in this case, Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier of 1945. But it's not there, just as the Haldane principle is not in the Haldane report of 1918. Now, Haldane always had supporters as well as detractors. The linear model, by contrast, has universally been regarded as a very bad idea. Accounts stressing the linear model serve a purpose. They say that policies for research in the past were wrong. We now need a radically new set. In fact, the policies of the past were uncannily like post-linear models proposed by opponents of the linear model. There's a deeper irony, in fact. Many accounts of the past themselves reflect this invented linear model, giving undue weight to academic research funded by government, perhaps according to the Haldane principle. In other words, our historical models have shaped our understanding of history rather than the other way around. Now, what might be the implications of this for thinking about policy? Let me cast this as advice to a young policy wonk, perhaps one just starting in the International Science Policy Centre here in the Royal Society. First, don't think with Haldane principles and linear models or two cultures. Think about them and their significance in debates and how they support each other. Note their rootedness in seemingly solid historical accounts. And note how they limit discussion to particular parts of a much more complex system. But that's just the beginning. I think you should probably also forget about science and about science policy. Sir Solly Zuckerman was right to talk about so-called science policy. There never was a definition of science and of policy that gives it a coherence to dignify it with the name science policy. There was no stable entity called science which is governed, worried about, applauded, condemned, invested in, or even understood. Science is governed by many institutions, and indeed, most science is not research. How might we think about policy, if not in these terms? Well, let me return to the mid-1980s and to the great controversies of that era. We need to think about ideas, about historical ideas, about the place of science in society, and of the conflict between them. I've already referred to one set of historical arguments, the technocratic doctrines of Bernal, Snow, and much of the academic science policy community. Yet the Thatcher Revolution was deeply hostile to this tradition. It drew instead not just on neoclassical but on Austrian economics, on radical liberal free marketeers with distinct approaches to knowledge. They had overlapped with and had much in common with the freedom in science campaigners of the 1940s and 1950s. The result was far from a coherent Thatcherite research policy. While the economy, industry, currency was liberalised and denationalised, while national manufacturing was deemed irrelevant, while departmental research programmes were massively cut back and sometimes privatised, we saw the nationalisation and centralisation of academic research. A profoundly anti-technocratic ideology used a technocratic justification for the silly belief that directed academic research would be economically transformative at the national level. Now, that sort of historical analysis of the recent past is important because New Labour continued, even extended the research policies of its predecessor, as it did so many other policies. But there was one decisive change in 1997, and that was the death of declinism in the discourse around British science. Now its strength was celebrated, for we now lived in cool Britannia, and one could sell success, but not the need to remedy failure. More generally, as is widely noted, post-1997 politics has little room for historical reflection. One is tempted to say that politics has become crassly futuristic. Everything changed, it was said of 9/11. It was claimed that war had changed forever with a revolution in military affairs. Modern high-tech shock and awe would work. In the stock market, we had new paradigms. And indeed, in the social sciences, we had the end of history. Private Eye, with some justification, satirises Brown's age of change. Now, what on earth can the historian do in these circumstances? We can note, for example, that recent policies rely on our forgetting. We need to forget that a policy has been announced twice before, 3 or 4 times before. It relies also on our moving on. But we can prick the bubble of this politics of fake novelty. We might note that the modernising, reforming New Labour government since 1997 have probably been the least innovative government since 1900. Less innovative, certainly, than the 13 wasted years of 1951 to 1964 the British technocrats complained so strongly about. Let me give an example. 20 years ago, Lady Thatcher, as she now is, put climate change high on the political agenda. Today, Gordon Brown, a historian, a PhD historian, deals in targets for decades hence, in gimmicks and in fantasies about Britain being a world leader in green technology. Perhaps this is masterly inactivity, but perhaps it is a true new politics. Now, we might, as historians, paradoxically, it seemed, help to get some genuine innovation into government. At the launch of the History and Policy website, Sir David Haldane suggested the appointment of a chief historical advisor. I don't think he had in mind that that historian would provide advice on innovation policy. Now, I propose this in jest, and yet historians are trained to understand the most obvious and most difficult thing to grasp about the future, that it's not yet happened, that it's highly uncertain, and that the past will continue to matter. Nowhere is this understanding more needed, I think, than in contemporary science policy. And I hope I do not cause offence by saying explicitly what I hope I've shown, that one social function of history is an increasing elite understanding of the relations of science and society, to use the language of the 1930s. And I hope I don't offend other students of science for making a particular claim for a broadly based historical approach. And I hope that I've given some indication of the relevance of history controlled by professional historians. History of science, not history for science, the fruits of our curiosity, you might say. I hope, too, that I've shown the impurity of history, its complex entanglement with the past, present, and future, its dangers as well as its rewards. Thank you very much.
Usually on occasions like this, the person in my situation has copious notes in case there is a need to stimulate questions. I have no such fears this evening after that magisterial sweep of the last century. Who would like, therefore, to tackle David with the first question? I'm sure there are queues of them out there. Sir, that's right.
I'd just like to point out a similarity between Quintin Hogg and Mrs. Thatcher, that we today look upon them in their later careers, whereas in their earlier careers, they were both, to a certain extent, attached to education. Quintin Hogg's father was a principal of a college in London, and Margaret Thatcher was Minister of Education and Science, in which she had her main influence.
Yes, indeed, Thatcher the Snatcher, I seem to remember. It was the milk, wasn't it, that was taken, the free school milk that was taken away. In fact, it's Quintin Hogg's grandfather who was the founder of the Regent Street Polytechnic. His father, also I think Quintin Hogg, was himself Lord Chancellor.
Next question, next point, please. Microphone's coming.
Terence Keeley. That was a brilliant talk, and I knew it would be, but I do want to put in a word for economics and greed, which I think you've slightly missed out. What is very interesting is what happened, I think, to take your global view when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in '79. And I think that we can see British society between 45 and 79 believing in the state, essentially, and after 79 believing effectively in markets. What's interesting is the continuity of science policy through this huge difference. And the reason, I think, is economics, or rather economic theories that are useful to the rich as well as to civil servants. I think what is very interesting is that since '79, we have been told endlessly that markets are efficient, rational expectations, supply-side economics. But the one thing we're always told when markets fail is in science. And I think if you see this as a Marxist from the perspective of the rich, it's very useful to be told that markets are efficient when you're trying to lower taxes in supply-side economics or trying to take regulation away because you want to rob the taxpayer through failing banks. It's also very useful to be told that although markets are perfect in almost everything, the one thing they're not perfect in is science, because then you can get government subsidies. So I think economics does play a role in understanding the long-term historical trend.
Yes, absolutely. And I did downplay the economics. There's a whole political economic story, which is, of course, necessarily focused on the private sector, which I've not really touched on in my story, except to note that people like Bernal had really written that out of the history of British science. And I think both of us share, from different political perspectives, a desire to put industry, the private sector, in its proper place in the history of British science and technology in the 20th century, for sure.
Next question. So.
Thank you. David, I very much enjoyed that. My name is Phil Gummett. I very much enjoyed that. I shall look forward to getting the text, because there are some phrases in there I want to make sure I've got exactly right. But there are some wonderful ones. History with massive forgetting built in. I think I quote accurately. Much new policy relies on us forgetting. Absolutely right. Do you think it's worse in the field you've been discussing than in other policy domains? I think of much of the debate about educational policy, but one could cite others. I'm not sure about this. It's a very important question. I'm tempted to answer yes, it is worse, simply because there's this long tradition of thinking about science and technology in futuristic ways. So the whole debate is already systematically biased to a future nobody knows. History is discounted. So I may have been overplaying to that extent the importance of history in debates, and therefore
overstressing the change in that respect in the last decade or so. But I agree, it is a very general problem, and it's become more of a problem. But I'd like to put it another way, that I think there is a worse problem of elite understanding of the area of science policy than there is, for example, elite understanding of military policy or diplomacy or economic policy. I think one can get a very serious discussion going about Keynesianism or about the PSBR or whatever it might be in the public arena, just as we get very interesting discussions about gardening, as E.B. Thompson would point out. But when it comes to science policy, it's are the public stupid? Are they wrong to be frightened by nanotechnology? We're not investing enough. If we don't invest, it was on the radio the other day, if we don't invest in something or other, Britain was going to lose its pharmaceutical industry. I mean, what's all that about? It's really low-grade stuff, isn't it? So I think because there's so much emphasis on the promotion of science, there's nowhere near enough debate about the ideas that sustain policy. So on reflection, I would say the problem is indeed worse in the area of science, which is particularly ironic because we have all these terribly clever people doing science, but perhaps they have learned more from Peter Mandelson, the spin doctors, than they care to admit.
Next question. Towards the back, sir. I notice there's a gender bias in our questioning so far, ladies in the audience.
Hi, Hassan Judi. Regarding the split between science and the arts, do you think that in British universities today, the levels of sort of humanities subjects in science and engineering courses is adequate, or is it lacking compared to, say, US or European universities? Thank you.
I think you know what my answer will be. It's not good enough, certainly not with respect to the United States. I'm not sure what the European situation is like by comparison with the British. I think Britain may well be ahead, if that's the right term. But my personal experience and the experience of many people in this room is that students in science and engineering and indeed medicine benefit enormously from courses in the history of science and technology and medicine. And they benefit in all sorts of ways. They benefit, I think, in terms of their own scientific studies, and they also benefit in all sorts of ways that lead to that help them in future careers, which, of course, typically not in science or engineering. So I hope the message will go out to vice-chancellors and others that history of science and technology and medicine is an important part of the curriculum.
Madam? Towards the front.
My question is, does science ever embrace spirituality? Because I would say maybe in many respects that's why science hasn't evolved itself, and at this stage we should have already been on the moon. And has that got to do with the fact that the scientists are not spiritual, and thus, I mean, because England is such a knowledgeable country of history and knowledge that without a doubt we should have been able to have gone to the moon by now. So maybe there's the aspect of spirituality that is missing.
I think you all heard that, by the way, despite because of the beautiful articulation. Does science embrace spirituality, is the nub of the question?
Well, I think many scientists wish it didn't. And they've long condemned it as a very, very bad thing that would precisely stand in the way of going to the moon and such like important projects. I don't think there was much spirituality on Apollo 11. I think, was there? Well, I followed Tom Wolfe and span him in the can type approach to space exploration. But I think if you ask the general question about the relations of science with things like religion and spirituality, I think most historians of science would say that the oppositions are creations largely of the 19th century, stoked up very strongly in the 20th century. There's nothing essential about science that makes it anti-spiritual, would be my answer.
Right at the back. Microphone's coming.
Ehsan Massoud from Nature. What, in your opinion, has the state of research in the history of science been in this period of the Labour government? how would you characterise it compared to other periods, say in the last 20 or 30 years? Research into the history of science.
Well, a very interesting question. I think we've done rather well, actually. I think history of science has not increased in numbers very much over the last 10 years, but it had increased in the previous 10 years quite considerably. And I think it's developed into a very exciting discipline that is really up there alongside general history, which in Britain is of quite exceptional strength. So I think we've done very well indeed. What else can I say? I need Peter Mandelson with me.
First here and then on the right.
I've been covering many of the developments you've described as a science journalist. Just wondering, a simple question. If you, as you say, science policy is a myth, who has really been most responsible for creating that myth, and whose interest does it serve? Is it essentially a myth created by scientists? I mean, your implication was, to a certain extent, it has been used to justify massive investments of government funding. Or to what extent has it almost a political myth, in that people are trying to create a modernist ideology based on the concept of a linear model, which is, in fact, itself has a political function?
Yes, there's a confluence of interest. First of all, the research bodies themselves, the research councils, OST, and all the rest of it, of course, insist that there is such a thing as science policy. Scientists talk about science budgets and things like this to promote the idea of science. Governments find it useful, especially have done in the recent past, but it's a very good way of putting off any serious decisions on things. And if one has to look at energy policy, the whole green environmental thing, to see that the answer from government is often, oh, we're doing research on this. We don't have to actually do anything much now, because the problem will be solved 20 years down the line. And there's a long tradition of using research instead of concrete policy. But I think it's very dangerous, and I think one reason it's very dangerous is that we have real living institutions, particularly universities, that need to be the focus of policy, rather than abstractions like science policy. And it's interesting that the most innovative universities in Britain and around the world are often the oldest ones. I think that tells us something about the importance of institutions of the long term. And I do think we have to focus very much on the kind of realities of knowledge creation, rather than the abstractions of political, dictated by political expediency and self-interest of research councils. I was utterly dismayed seeing the definition of the still relevant, allegedly still relevant Haldane principles by the Secretary of State for Innovation, Universities and Skills. He said that one of the principles was that the research councils were the guardians of the independence of science. Most extraordinary idea, that there wasn't a world out there of independent universities or learned societies. But perhaps he was telling it how he saw it, that for government, science does mean government-funded stuff, and that's the stuff that we're going to run. And if there was going to be an independent bit of science, it would be the government who would be appointing the people to do the independent bit of science. It's an extraordinary state-centered vision. And you see it in all the research councils. I mean, one sees the Arts and Humanities Research Council writing as if it's the only group that's concerned with the health of the arts and humanities in the British Isles. Not so at all. We have a very dispersed, still, thankfully, a system of promoting, of creating research in the arts and the humanities. We need to be aware of the politics, as you suggest so well.
David, we'd have one last question. There was somebody on the aisle here. The gentleman in the white shirt was ahead of you, sir. And then we really must move to a conclusion.
Thank you. Ian Taylor. I'm a journalist, though not a science journalist, but I think your book, The Shock of the Old, should be required reading for all journalists. A couple of questions, if I may. I wonder if you see the long-term decline of the British economy in relation to its competitors from the 19th century through the last century as a factor in what you're talking about, and that one aspect of it is an argument within the political elite about an attempt, how do we address that long-term decline and restore rates of profitability and so on. And secondly, in relation to research, I wonder how you define research, because much of what passes for research, for example, at pharmaceutical companies, might not be defined as research if you take another definition. And I wonder what you think about the subject and direction of much research now, given the intertwining of business and academia.
On the last point, I do think we need a new constitutional settlement, or a constitutional settlement for the first time, I should say, for government funding of knowledge creation. And I do think part of that settlement has got to be it's government's responsibility to fund knowledge that is truly independent of either state or business interests. Now, I think that's a real priority, and one reason I object so much to talk of Haldane and linear models is that we're not addressing those fundamental questions that you're raising there. On the question of the decline, the relative decline of Britain, well, it's interesting that Britain was relatively declining at its fastest when the R&D budgets were at their highest. And as they've come down since the 1960s, the standard view is that the relative decline has got less severe, certainly in comparison with Western Europe and the United States. So yes, there have been some people who wanted to reverse the decline by investments in research and development. But that line of thinking was much stronger in the past than it has been in the last 30 or 40 years. And your first question, I can't remember. I'm not going to get into that. It's of course it's a huge topic, and definitions are hugely important. And I'd rather cut out some discussion of the definition of science. I mean, something called the Science Council laboured for a year to come up with a definition of science, which didn't actually exclude history, I'm glad to say. Which is as it should be, but in fact it didn't define science; it defined research, which is a very different thing.
David, with that, don't go away for a moment. I have a pleasant duty to perform, but with that last hanging question, you've given us an ample excuse to invite David back again, because I think by common consent, and indeed many of you from the floor have made this comment, that was truly a brilliant and stimulating and for me personally a challenging lecture, David. Like a number of you in this audience, I grew up in this era that you're describing. I was born at the end of the war. I went through the white-hot heat of technology and all the rest of it. And I've seen the Research Council coming. I was distinctly uncomfortable as a former Research Council chairman when you touched on that subject there. And some of the nuggets of truth I have written down, but I won't quote them verbatim now because, like many of you, I want to rush straight to the Royal Society's website when I get home this evening and download from the webcast, no charge, ladies and gentlemen, it's access material, some of the gems, but I'll take away a number which, if I can paraphrase what you said, as a scientist myself, the idea that independent scientists pursuing some quest for truth in science is alive and well in this storm and maelstrom that's going on around us politically and policy-wise and so forth. That I take, and indeed any young scientists here this evening, you should take away as encouragement to you. The fact that the independence of science and the integrity of the whole process matters so much to you as an historian and indeed as a scientist, I take away also as a positive message. Science is not just for the scientists. Science is indeed for everybody, which is what we stand for here at the Society. But David, can I return again to what I said at the outset? A truly stimulating, truly challenging, hugely entertaining lecture. I apologize profusely for our temporary absence of world cutting-edge technology on the screen. But in order to make up for that in a small manner, if I reach under here, I first of all have a splendid medal to present you with. I hope you'll treasure that on behalf of everybody here this evening. and a certificate and a token of all of our appreciations. Ladies and gentlemen, join me again in thanking Professor David Edgerton for a wonderful lecture.